Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming back to the second session on the stage today. I'm Amy, one of the co-founders of Civic Square, and today I'm joined by Rob Hopkins, and I'm going to share a bit more about Rob shortly. But just to say that we're really excited to have you here on the first day of the festival. We hope you join many of the sessions across the different platforms that we're on. And this one will hopefully be an inspiring hour where you can sit back, kick back and listen to some ideas that we was absolutely fascinated by. So I just want to introduce Rob. Rob is the co-founder of Transition Towns Totnes and the Transition Network. He's also the author of The Power of Just Doing Stuff, the Transition Handbook, and his latest book, From What If to What Is. No, From What If to What Next. So this is we're so excited to host this conversation because I've just been completely inspired by the accessibility and the ideas in the book. And so to kick off the session, I'm actually going to read from the bit that made me look up who Rob was and ask the Civic Square team whether we could find a way to get in touch and bring him to the festival. So I hope you'll enjoy this on that. Before I'll hand over to Rob to lead his talk, where he's going to tell you lots more about the key ideas in the book, From What Is to What If. During my reading and Rob's talk, please feel free to add your questions in the chat. Let us know questions you have for Rob, and we'll be coming back at the end to ask Rob some of those questions. And we'll put all of Rob's social details in the chat so you can follow him in your own time. So I picked up this book a couple of months ago, and I opened the first page and started reading, and something just moved in me where I was like, the power of the simplicity and the beauty of what Rob had laid out. And so I'm actually going to read that to you before Rob's going to take you on a bit of a talk. So, what if things turned out okay? I wake, well rested, in the straw bale walled apartment my family and I go home. Built 15 years ago, as part of the Sustainable Construction Initiative throughout our city, the 3-story high apartment complex costs virtually nothing to heat. Its basement hosts composting units for all the building's toilets, and the solar panels on the roof generate all our electricity needs. I wake my kids, get them dressed and fed, and accompany them to school. A walk that takes us through shared gardens with a diversity of food crops, including young ruby shard whose deep red leaves radiate like stained glass. Caught in the brilliant sun of this late spring morning, the streets are quiet due to sparse motorized traffic, and they are lined with fruit and nut trees in the early blossom. The air smells of spring. Each bus stop we pass is surrounded by a garden on 3 sides. Part of the edible bus stop network that now includes most bus stops across the United Kingdom. Anyone can graze while they wait for the bus. And just before I carry on, this is where I really encourage the audience just to close your eyes and think about, can you imagine this? Can you imagine seeing that edible bus stop network surrounded by gardens and growth of beautiful fruit and food? In our community, the kids seem to have radically different feelings about school than they did 10 years ago. The education department's decision to eliminate testing, to give ample space for unstructured play, and to provide students with opportunities within the community to acquire meaningful skills that enable them to live happy and healthy lives by their own definition, means that most kids now love going to school. My son, for example, recently upped his cooking skills by spending a week at a local restaurant. My kids and I approach the school through intensive food gardens planted and managed by the students, and will walk into a building where we are greeted by the smell of baking bread and the sound of happy chatter. After we say our goodbyes, I pick up a public bicycle and head into the city on one of our cycle networks. With more bicycles and fewer cars on the road, air quality has improved, and public health along with it. I call into my favourite bakery to buy bread. Launched 15 years ago on the premise that now baking is the new Prozac, the bakery's mission is to provide meaningful work opportunities for people who lack housing and job security and who struggle with mental health. The bakery prioritizes local produce, grows a thriving rooftop garden, and uses bicycle-powered delivery around town. With the bakery's support, many of its employees have launched other successful businesses across the city. I passed what used to be one of the district supermarkets, most of which had closed down 10 years ago. The explosion in community food production and a rapid shift of community investment led to a withdrawal of support from supermarkets, which precipitated the collapse of the industrial food model over the space of only a couple of years. The building was repurposed and became home to a variety of local food processors, small-scale manufacturing, and a training centre linked to local schools. The place is buzzing. Our former supermarket houses a mill that processes locally grown grains, as well as a sawmill that processes locally harvested timber. What have been extensive car parks are now intensive food gardens, modelled on those that surrounded Paris 100 years ago, and they provide local food for the local markets. I called by the train station to buy tickets for a trip the following week. Bringing the trains into public ownership 12 years ago eliminated the days when every train station looked the same, with the same cafes, chains, and shops. Now every station is a manifestation of the local economy, its innovators, its unique flavours and tastes. Ours now has twice the number of outlets as before and reflects the cultural diversity of our community. There is even a brewery on the station. You can have a drink surrounded by the fermenters while you wait for your train. Oh, and now the trains run on time. The many people from other places who arrived here during the times of the Great Migration have assimilated, and now it's hard to remember this community without them. While the transition wasn't without its challenges, the culture, the richness, and the enterprise they have brought has much enriched us all. I call into work. I'm working half day today as part of my 3-day work week. Adopted nationally 10 years ago, the 3-day work week, together with the introduction of universal basic income, has resulted in measurably lower levels of anxiety and stress across all income classes. People spend free time working on community projects and enjoying their lives. Some of my colleagues are away today. A scheme was recently launched where up to 10% of staff from any company at any given time are embedded in the local community, offering managerial, marketing, financial planning and project management skills to organisations that are working in various ways to support residents and make our community more resilient. I pick my kids up from school and we stroll home down the streets where many of the houses are painted with eye-catching murals and mosaics. There are lots of kids playing in the street, a phenomenon that occurred naturally once the number of cars on the road had diminished, which has turned to encourage residents to periodically close their streets entirely to motorised traffic. So children can play out. All the neighbours look out for the kids, something made possible when adults began spending more time at home rather than trapped in long commutes to a distant workplace. After supper, I head out to a neighbourhood assembly. A few years ago, a group of residents, not aligned to any political party, were voted to run our city government. They altered the city's governance model to enable and support the initiatives emerging at the neighbourhood scale and to remove obstacles. They even created a civic imagination office to better inspire and support the imaginations of local communities and to enable their ideas to become a reality. About 70 people are at this particular meeting, and we discuss our vision for the future of energy in our neighbourhood and some other pressing local issues. Policy making has improved hugely. Thanks to the community energy company set up in 2021, the majority of the city's energy is now locally generated, and most citizens have some kind of financial investment in it. It generates a far better return than most of the banks do. When I reach home, I visit with several of my neighbours who are sitting outside chatting. We hear an owl and notice the bats swooping overhead. The move to designate our city a national park city slowed the decline of biodiversity to the point of recovery. by reunifying previously fractured wildlife corridors, green spaces and woods, so that I now regularly notice new kinds of insects and louder and more complex birdsong. With so much around me moving, changing and thriving, I settle down to sleep with the feeling that the future is rich with possibility. And this is where I'm going to start to hand over to Rob, because the next line says, it sounds made up, doesn't it? It is mostly. The story is my imagining of the new feature and a story of how things turned out okay. And that was the moment where I just thought the power of just imagining what would happen if you just thought out, what if things turn out okay? And some of the similarities in what had happened over the COVID lockdown and some of the early ideas that were starting to emerge just felt like the perfect time to welcome Rob to us in the Department of Dreams, which I feel like is a project that he probably would have imagined in his own head as well, seeing that the Office of Civic Imagination. So I'm going to hand over to Rob. I'll be off the screen for the next half an hour or so. And yeah, I really hope that you enjoyed just being inspired by his great work. Thank you so much, Rob.
Thank you. That was beautiful to hear you reciting that. And hello everybody. And it's lovely to be here at the Department of Dreams. I'm going to talk for about half an hour, and I want to build off that, I guess, because it feels to me that kind of imagining work is so precious. And Ursula Le Guin, one of the great guardians of the imagination in our world, said, as great scientists have said, and as all children know, it is above all by the imagination that we achieve perception and compassion and hope. Another thing I would say about that story that Imi read out is that everything pretty much in that story already exists. I've already been and visited all of those things. So it's not like there's stuff in there that's scientific, science fiction. We know that all of that stuff works. It's about scaling it out. So what I want to do now is to share my screen with you so I can show you some pictures which will illustrate what it is that I want to tell you about. So hopefully you can see that and you can see me as well. I wanted to start just by giving a bit of context, I guess. A lot of the work that I've been doing around imagination has come out of my work around climate change. Because I started the book that Imi read from because I kept reading people who I really admire and respect, climate activists who kept saying climate change is a failure of the imagination. And it really stuck with me. I would think, why are we having a failure of the imagination in 2020 at the very time when our survival depends on our ability to reimagine and rebuild everything? You know, we know that the COVID crisis led over those couple of months to a fall of about 5.5% in our carbon emissions. In order to avoid a runaway future where things like these fires in Australia become the norm, we know we need to be cutting 7-8% every year, building every year. That means we need to reimagine food, we need to reimagine transport, we need to reimagine how our cities work. And so fundamentally, this is really about us needing a muscle that should be like that, but I think at the moment is kind of like this. And I feel one of the reasons for that is that we're living in the time of what Henry Giroux, an activist in the US, calls the disimagination machine. You know, I worry that we are living in a sort of a perfect storm of things that whether it's media, whether it's politics, whether it's austerity, we know that anxiety and stress and trauma cause the part of our brain where our imagination fires from to shrink. And in many ways, I think there are aspects where imagination is kind of a function of privilege, that if your basic needs on Maslow's hierarchy of needs for food and shelter and safety aren't met, then it's very, very hard to have an imaginative life. And in the first session this morning, I heard one of the speakers talk about Adrienne Marie Brown. And in her book, Emergent Strategy, she writes, imagination is one of the spoils of colonization, which in many ways is claiming who gets to imagine the future for a given geography. Losing our imagination is a symptom of trauma. We are living in the ancestral imagination of others with their longing for safety and abundance, a longing that didn't include us. And I worry that in many ways we have created a kind of a perfect storm which is causing our imagination to shrink at the very time we need it to expand, which is what I want to look at in this presentation, is how do we start to build back the imagination? And one way, I think, is as Imi did at the beginning there, is to share stories about how the future could be. We so often try to inspire people to get involved in making change by scaring the shit out of them and showing them deeply depressing, terrifying pictures. I wonder what it would be like instead, actually, if we showed people images of how the world could be if we got things right, and how the world would be if we did absolutely everything that we could possibly do to build a sustainable, just, equitable, fair future going forward. This is the work of an artist called James Mackay in Leeds, who I always call the man who draws the future. And this is one of his drawings of a city of the future. If our cities were full of biodiversity, if we created the conditions for our cities to be rich with biodiversity. This is his picture of what it would be like if we filled our cities with food being grown. Once we start to take the cars out of our cities, which many cities are now intentionally doing as we emerge from lockdown, that frees up an awful lot of space that we need to do something with. So maybe we fill those streets with food being grown, our children walk to school through food being grown, it becomes part of their everyday culture, living in that kind of seasonal environment. And for me, why this matters so much, that we allow ourselves to imagine it, comes to me from an expression from Rilke, the poet, who said, "The future must enter into you a long time before it happens." And I'll say that again because I think it's so beautiful. The future must enter into you a long time before it happens. So I find that a lot of the work that I do, whether it's this work around imagination or in the transition movement, is about longing, is about creating longing. How do we create a longing for a future that turned out as we know it could? And that is not something that we achieve through providing people with facts and statistics and information. It comes from storytelling. It comes from creating longing. When we went to the moon, when Neil Armstrong went to the moon in 1969, it wasn't his idea. We'd been going to the moon for decades before that. In stories, in song, Frank Sinatra went to the moon, Tintin went to the moon, everybody went to the moon. By the time he actually went to the moon, we'd been there hundreds and hundreds of times. But we had created such a deep longing that it became inevitable that we would go. And that feels to me like what we need to do around these issues. So what I would like to do in my time with you here today is to explore this, which is when I had just finished writing the book, I had someone who was renting a room in my house who was studying at Schumacher College, who took the draft and who then did his dissertation based on the draft of the book as it was at the time. And in conversations that we had and through his understanding of the book, he created this, which I just love, which for me, this tries to answer the question, okay, if we recognize that we're living in a time of imaginative poverty, we're living in a time where our collective imagination is declining at the worst time for that to possibly happen, how do you reverse that trend? How do you start to expand the imagination back out again? And so I want to share with you these four things: space, place, practices, and pacts, which are the things that I came out of writing the book thinking those are the things we need to focus on. And I'm going to go through each of them and tell you a few stories. The first one is space. So you will know as you sit wherever you are listening to this, that the times in your life when you come up with your most brilliant ideas, when you are at your most imaginative, are not when you're sitting in front of your laptop at 5 in the afternoon with a deadline at 8 o'clock that day. They're probably not in a white room with strip lighting and someone in front of a whiteboard saying, "Ideas, people, ideas." Albert Einstein always said his best ideas came to him when he was cycling in the forest. I always find my best ideas come when I go out, and I'm out and I go for a walk. There was a mathematician called Andrew Wiley who had what he called his 3B mantra. He said his best ideas came in bed, on the bus, or in the bath. The imagination needs space. And we have created an economy and a culture where people have less and less and less space. We're so dashing about, we're so busy that we have less and less space. And then often any space that we do have, we fill up with social media and Facebook and trying to scroll to the bottom of that feed. And we lose so much of that daydreaming space that's essential. So it's vital that we design into our movements, into our organizations, space for the imagination, because it doesn't happen otherwise. It just gets designed out by busyness. We have to make an intentional decision to create space. In the transition movement since the beginning, we used open space as a fabulous tool for bringing groups of people together around a question that really motivates them to then have the conversations that matter, but you make the space, otherwise those conversations never happen. And for so many people in our daily life, there's less and less space just even for play. And this is a beautiful project in Bristol called Playing Out, which I visited when I was researching the book, where they make it easier for communities to close their streets for children to play. And a woman I spoke to, a mother I spoke to on the street, said to me, this isn't anti-car, this is pro-community. And once you get the cars out of the way, play just naturally comes back and fills those spaces. I went to this street full of children skipping and chalk drawings on the street. I spoke to one of the dads who said, well, after about 6 months of doing this, we realized that actually we quite liked each other. And so making space for these things is so important. In my town, we created what we called a festival of street games. We closed the square, again, to make an intentional space for play. And for the first half of it, the adults all stood around the edge and said, isn't this great? Our children are playing. And the second half, the adults decided they could play too. And then it was just chaos. And one of my favorite games that I saw that day was a Dutch game called Spekerpoepen, which literally means, I think, nail poops. And where you tie a piece of string with a nail around the back of your trousers or your skirt with a nail on it, and then looking backwards through your legs, you have to try and get the screw or the nail into the neck of the bottle. Fabulous. This little girl was playing this game for about 10 minutes, completely absorbed, her attention span completely restored and completely focused. And making that intentional space for people to come together and rediscover play is so precious. So I think that fundamentally, if we want to build the imagination, we must look at creating space. And on a bigger scale, we need to be looking at things like a universal basic income, a 4-day week, strategies like this that actually also give people intentional space in their lives. The second one is place. How do we create gathering places that provide platforms for the collective imagination? This is a transition group in London who went out one Saturday and Sunday and lined their high street, I think it's in Kilburn, with beautiful flowering fruit trees in pots. So they could have conversations with passers-by about the role of trees in urban spaces, and all of those trees then found homes and created a kind of a patchwork orchard throughout the area. But it gave people a sense during those couple of days of seeing a place they knew really well in a different light. What if our high street was an orchard, a kind of pop-up tomorrow, if you like? This is in Berlin, Princess Innengarten, one of the best urban agriculture demonstration projects. Big tourist attraction in Berlin. Fabulous. You go there, you spend an hour wandering around. When you leave, somehow urban space looks different. You look at every little corner and you think, what could we grow here? What could we grow there? What could we grow up that wall? You know, we need places that shift our imagining as to what might be possible. The guy in the middle here is called Jason Roberts, and Jason lives in Houston, Texas, and he runs a project called Better Block. And Better Block look at unloved places that nobody really cares about very much, like this. Nobody loves this place. And they talk to people around and they get a sense of what people dream of, and then they go away and they make stuff. And then overnight, they arrive at dusk and they build overnight. So the next morning, that place has been transformed. Again, it's like a pop-up tomorrow that gives people a taste of a different future. So the next day, it looks like this. I love this idea of just taking places that we know really well, but bringing the kind of vision in the piece of writing that Imi read at the beginning and bringing it to life in those places now. And it doesn't have to be big projects like this. It can sometimes be small things. This is a thing I love that started in San Francisco and which now happens all around the world, called Parking Day. A group of activists were thinking, where can we get affordable exhibition space, which, as you imagine, in San Francisco, easy. And then one of them said, well, if we bought a ticket for a car parking space, we paid for the ticket all day, there's no law that says you have to park a car in it, is there? You could actually do whatever you liked in that space. So on Parking Day, all around the world, activists buy a parking ticket and they do something different in that car parking space. They might do yoga in it. They might play big games, big board games in it. Sometimes people get married in them. People start little cafes or libraries or all sorts of stuff in them. People do, I have no idea what this is, but they do that in there as well. You know, to take over those spaces, take them back as people's spaces, and do something in them that sort of starts to change people's sense of what the future could be and what that space is for. And sometimes places can also be a town or a city that is telling a new story about what the future could be like. And being involved in the transition movement, I get to visit many places that are moving towards doing that. This is one of my favorite in the northeast of France, in the Alsace, a former mining town called Ungersheim, where in the 80s the mines closed, everybody lost their jobs. And there was a guy became the mayor there in, I think, about 2010 called Jean-Claude Mensch, whose father was a miner. He'd been a miner, trade union organizer. And one day he saw a film about the transition movement and said, let's do that, all of that. And when you visit Ungersheim now, they have the biggest solar farm in the region. They have a local currency called the radish. They do, all of the food is organic in the schools, and most of it is grown on a market garden on the edge of the town. They built this beautiful building that you see in the top right as a place to process that food and create more work and jobs for people from it. It's just amazing. They have low energy street lighting. The whole thing is just phenomenal. And when you go there, you hear all the stories, but you also hear people's personal experience of how a process like this has brought the community closer together, how it has meant that people don't feel lonely and powerless and isolated anymore, but people are starting to build back their relationships. And there's a great French film called What Are We Waiting For that tells the story of this place, which is really worth watching. So that's spaces and place. The next one is pacts. How do we use practices that connect us and change our frame of possibility? And I mentioned at the beginning about this idea that imagination to a degree is a function of privilege, and that we need to create the conditions for everybody to live an imaginative life. I think we need some way to enshrine the right to an imaginative life, in legislation even. And I visited Dundee in Scotland, this amazing project called Art Angel, run by this woman called Rosalie Somerton, who is just brilliant. And there at Art Angel, they work with people with mental health problems, anxiety, burnout, stress. Sometimes they're what's the word? Like prescribed to go there by their doctor, and sometimes they I've forgotten the word. Anyway, they go along on because they choose to. And the way they work there is they say, when you walk through the door here, you're not a patient or a client, you're an artist who is preparing work for an exhibition. And they have all the paints, as you can see, and all the materials, and they work with people. And I went up there for a day and met various people who are the artists there, and it was really, really moving. I spoke to one woman. She said, I spent the last 4 years in my pajamas, and last year, 6 months ago, I came that close to taking my own life, even though I have two beautiful small children. And in the 6 months that I've been coming here, I can see the future again. The future had disappeared out of my life, which is one of the things that happens when the imagination contracts, is that the future disappears. And you could see how creating and holding a space like this, when I said to them, how do you do this? They said, fundamentally, this place is about safety and hope. They're just amazing. And so one of the things they do every year to keep their funding going is they do a kind of an evaluation of how well their work is going. And they don't give people a long, extensive questionnaire. They give them a piece of paper with two shapes of a human body. And they say, fill the first one to show how you felt before you came here, and the other to show how you feel now you've been coming here for a while. And I looked through a pile of these. It was very, very moving. I'm just going to show you one of them. If we're going to be successful in this transition to a low carbon, fair, equitable, just future, that's what it'll feel like. If we get it right, the transition that we need to do will feel like this. How can we bring imagination into our work as activists who are trying to support communities in imagining a different future than the one that feels like it's on offer through business as usual economics? This is an exercise that was developed in the transition movement along with a company called Encounters Arts, who are a community arts organization, which we call Transition Town Anywhere. Transition Town Anywhere is one of the most beautiful, moving, extraordinary things I've ever been part of. You take anywhere between 200 and 400 adults, you take a big space. This is Battersea Arts Centre, the Grand Hall at Battersea Arts Centre. And you invite people to imagine that they are stepping into the future. They're stepping forward 10 years into the future, into a future that's not utopia, but it's a future where everything that we could possibly have done was done. and then they imagine themselves in that future, and then there's a process whereby you start to think, well, what am I doing in this future? What's my role? What do I do in this future? And then you meet other people who share that interest, and together you design projects, things you're going to do together. And then you physically build it out of cardboard and bamboo and chairs and sticky tape and pens, and then you build and inhabit and play in a kind of three-dimensional version of the future in a way that is just magical. To be among 300 adults completely lost in this vision of the future that they have designed and built, and you're working out who you're going to trade with and what the relationships are, and it's just absolutely glorious. The last time we did this exercise at Battersea Arts Centre, these two young men designed the public transport system for Transition Town. Now this might look to you like a few cardboard boxes and some bamboo canes and a bit of string. These guys could tell you everything about how this transport system worked, what it ran on, where it went, what its tickets looked like, what the seats were made from. Absolutely, it was a completely three-dimensional thing in their imagining, and it was the same for everything that was here. And you might be thinking, well, that sounds very nice, Rob, and that sounds very nice for people to spend a little while. But actually, how does that help? Well, this is me in 2012. And I ended up, the first time we did this exercise, with a group of people creating what we called the Yeast Collective, which was a brewery and a mill and a bakery in the same space. And then the next year in my town, I was part of a group who started an actual brewery called the New Lion Brewery. But always in my heart was the vision, was the dream that we had played that day. And so last year, we converted the New Lion Brewery into being a 100% community-owned business. We now have 270 owners. We raised £180,000 through a crowdfunder to enable the brewery to move into the same space as a bakery and as a mill. And when we were doing this, and people would say, but Rob, how do you know this is going to work? I would say, I know this will work because I played it. I absolutely, fundamentally, profoundly know this will work because I played it. And play works like that. It allows you to try things out in a way that is really, really powerful. Those drawings I showed you at the beginning of the place of the future, this is the man who drew them. This is James Mackay. James works for the University of Leeds, where he does, one of the things he does is he goes out into the streets and he just starts to draw what's in front of him. And then he stops people as they walk by and says, excuse me, how do you think this place might be in the future? And then he draws that into his drawing. And he says, all you need is a really simple sketch. And when he started doing this work, he was very pessimistic about the future, but he said, now I feel really, really optimistic about the future. You know, this stuff is really, really powerful, actually. And the Swedish government recently employed this guy here, whose name is Per Gronqvist. And his job title is to be the Swedish government's chief storyteller. And his job description is just brilliant. It is to communicate the realities of day-to-day living in a carbon-neutral world. To communicate the realities of day-to-day living in a carbon-neutral world. Again, to bring stories like the one that Imi read at the beginning alive in people's imagination is so, so precious and so, so important. And we can create economic models and democratic models that invite our imagination. At the moment, we're living in, as I said, a kind of a disimagination machine, which is incentivizing us to have imaginative lives, doesn't value or invite our imagination, and when it does, generally ignores it entirely. How could you create an economic system that invites the imagination? This is in Preston, the Preston model, which I'm sure many of you will have heard about, where in order to try to revive the city, rather than saying we need a big Amazon fulfillment center on the, what a horrible abuse of the word fulfillment, on the edge of our city, actually what we're going to do is use the key anchor institutions of the city, the university, the hospital, the school, the local government, to spend their money into the economy of the city to drive a different economic story, to kind of localize the economy and maximize the flows of money in the city, as a result of which it's now one of the most improved cities in the country. We can choose to create an economic framework which invites and incentivizes and nurtures the imagination, or we can create an economic system which undermines and devalues and belittles the imagination. So I want to just tell you a couple of little stories of things I've seen through the transition movement where people have invited the imagination and wonderful things have happened. And this is really about the art of asking a really great what-if question. which for me feels like one of the great skills that we need to nurture and cultivate. This is in Tooting, in South London. This is a bus turning circle. Nobody loves this bus turning circle. This bus turning circle is a place which is normally full of buses who have their engines just ticking over. The air quality is horrible. People rush by it. They don't really care about this place. So one day, Transition Tooting, they saw this place and they said, actually, Tooting doesn't really have a kind of a village green or a town square or kind of a people's space. Maybe it could be there. That could be a really good one. So they crowdfunded £2,000. They put on an event called the Tooting Twirl, where they took that place over and they turned it into a village green. They spent a day saying, what if this was our village green? And they filled it with food and flowers and coffee and carnival and conversation, and they put real grass down on the ground. I got to sit with my with the green grass of Tooting between my toes on that lovely July Saturday afternoon. And as I sat there that whole day, I noticed the conversations began to change from, if this was our village green, to, when this is our village green, somewhere deep underneath the kind of tectonic plates of permission began to shift and move. It was just magical to see. And I saw people who were looking at this wall here, which is the wall of Primark. You know, if there was a competition for London's dullest wall, this would definitely make the top 3. Nobody loves that wall or ever even looks at it. That day I heard lots of people say, when this is our village green, what will we paint on that wall? What story of ourselves will we want to paint on that wall? And when I spoke to the organisers afterwards, they said, let nobody now after today say that this isn't possible. Once people have had a taste of seeing this in a different way, it's very, very, very hard to go back from that. This is the other one I wanted to share with you from Liège in Belgium. So in Liège in Belgium, the transition group there started a project called Ceinture Alimentaire, which means the food belt. And their what if question was, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? Beautiful. It's a beautiful question. They did a big event 5 years ago that I went to, where they invited chefs and farmers and academics and everyone who cared about food. And then I went back last year and I was blown away. And it was very moving for me as somebody who spent 12 years going around the world with a kind of imagining in my head that you heard in the passage at the beginning of how the future could be, to go to a city where that was already happening and I could walk around in it and have my lunch in it, and it was wonderful. They've created 21 new cooperatives. They raised €5 million of investment from local people to make that stuff happen. There's a farm, 2 vineyards, a brewery, 4 shops now called the Small Producers, which sells food from local farmers. They have a local currency that runs through the whole thing. It was just amazing. I met the mayor of the city who said, we used to say we want to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. And we recognize that we didn't start this and that our role is just to get out of the way and to remove all the obstacles to this growing and scaling, which it is doing rapidly. They're now looking at how to change how how universities, schools, and a whole range of institutions now source their food. It's just wonderful. And when I said to them, why does this work? They said, because of the narrative. We had a really strong narrative. So my last one before we open out for questions is pact. Pact might feel like a strange word to use in relation to the imagination. All of you, I'm sure, watching this will have had experiences where your imagination is invited. Maybe it's a consultation around a housing development or a change in your organization or something. You go along and you write your brilliant ideas on Post-it notes, and then you go home and they chuck all the Post-it notes in the bin and do what they were going to do anyway. And it always feels to me like if you invite the imagination, you have to fundamentally respect that and meet it halfway. This is in Derby, where Derby Museums closed the Silk Mill Museum, which was one of the first, it was an industrial museum, and invited a woman called Hannah Fox. They gave her a small amount of money. They said, just have a play and see what you come up with. Her what if question was, what if the community redesigned and rebuilt this museum? So she started by putting a workshop in the middle of the museum and inviting volunteers to come along and build the furnishings and all the things that made up the museum. Then they went on to then redesign what the museum was going to be, to reconceive it as a museum of making. And they have pioneered a whole way of doing big construction projects where the tendering is done in such a way that the community is involved to the maximum possible at every single step, every single stage of rebuilding it. They met the community halfway. They invited their imagination. The woman here holding the microphone is called Gabriela Gomez Mont, and she would love to know that there is an event called the Department of Dreams happening today. She, with some other people, conceived what she thought of as a ministry of imagination within the government of the city of Mexico. The mayor invited her to create this department. Half of it is made up of like transport planners and engineers. The other half is made up of poets and artists and filmmakers. And they do the most amazing things. And their role is to safeguard and protect and nourish the imaginative life of that city. And in Bologna, the municipality there in Italy created what they called a civic imagination office. And a civic imagination office sits between the municipality and the people. And it runs like a transition group. It runs big visioning, open space. And then when people come up with ideas, the municipality meet them halfway and create packs. And so they'll say, that's a great idea. Okay, we'll offer this, this, and this to make it happen. And you'll offer that and that? Good. Okay, let's make it. And in the last 5 years in Bologna, they've made 500 pacts that range from, let's take over that little bit of tarmac and make a food garden, all the way through to, we're going to take this office block over and turn it into a school to train young people to be classical musicians. They meet the imagination halfway, which is a fundamentally respectful and phenomenal thing to do. They now use that whole process, the Civic Imagination Office process, as a way of distributing participatory budgeting, as a way of allocating uses for empty buildings. It's one of the most exciting bringing together of new democracy and imagination that I've yet come across. So I just want to close with a little story that for me feels like it pulls those four things together. Last year I was in France in a little town called Montsartou, about half an hour north from Nice, where the French government a while ago said something like, we're going to bring in a new rule so that 20% of food in schools should be organic. And in Montsartou, they said, well, if 20% is better than 0%, why are we stopping at 20%? Surely 100% is where we should be aiming. So they decided unilaterally that they were going to go for 100% organic food. And then they bought a piece of land on the edge of Montsartou to create a market garden, to grow that food. So they now grow 70% of the food for all the schools in Montsartou in this market garden. And it was just beautiful, full of bees and butterflies. And, you know, what they found was that that creating this garden, which for me, this project is a win-win-win-win-win-win-win project. It's good for mental health, public health, physical health, local economy, biodiversity. But they also found all kinds of knock-on benefits where parents, 60% of parents in the school who before had never bought organic food started buying organic food. Families who had never cooked before started cooking at home because the kids were involved in cooking with this produce in the school. It's just wonderful. And it somehow is about meeting the needs that people expressed for a different way of eating and for their children to be healthier, and creating a new economy that meets so many of our needs as a result. So that's what I wanted to share with you today, was this. So space, place, practices and pacts feels like if we can model that, and we can model this in our organizations, we can model this in our schools, we can model this in university, we can model it at all different kind of scales. It really feels to me like it's something that would really function well at all different levels. And just to wrap up, so Imi mentioned the book, but also if you're interested, I've recently started a new series of podcasts called What If to What Next, where I invite people to send me in their what if questions, and then I find the best people to go off and explore with them how we might actually make that a reality. So far we've done, what if birdsong drowned out the traffic? What if a universal basic income sparked a revival of the imagination? What if doctors' surgeries were catalysts for the transition? And another one that I can't quite remember. But anyway, so if you want to find out any more, have a look at that.
That was so wonderful, and it was really lovely to see that all wrapped up together in so many beautiful examples and practical manifestations of it in so many different places. And I loved at the beginning, after I finished the reading, you saying, you know, none of this is new, this is all happening in different places. There was just a story that you put together about that. So we've got some questions coming through from the audience, and I've got a couple, so I'll just get started with those questions straight away, and we can carry on the conversation because we've got a neat half an hour to do this, which is which is lovely. Okay, so the first question is, I'm going to start off with my own first question, built on a comment that Daniel shared in the chat, where he talked about imagining the idea, manifesting it, and just executing it was, and embodying it was so amazing to see some of those things in your talk. And also, I loved the bit where you talk about the respect of meeting an idea halfway and the imagination halfway. So I know a little bit about your history, but when I told a friend that you were coming on to the Department of Dreams, she talked about how you had come, and I hope this is true because otherwise it's going to be a bit weird, isn't it? But how you'd thought up the idea for transition towns when you were on a permaculture course, and how it grew from there. And I'm just interested in how your own ideas have gone from, because Transition Network is now global, how you've gone from imagining some of this and making it practically real in the world.
Yeah, well, I guess my background was, as you say, was being a permaculture teacher. I came across permaculture in 1992, and it kind of completely blew my mind. Someone gave me a book about permaculture, and it contained this concept of earth repair. I was like, what? Someone's written a book about earth repair? What? How to put it all back together again? And then I did my permaculture course, and it felt like my brain was kind of rewired in a way that now I think of as an imagination thing. It meant that I could walk down the street, and the street no longer looked like the street looked like. It looked like how it could be. And I could see the gardens that could be there, and what could be growing up the wall, and where the rainwater could be being collected, and how it could then be being used for different things. So it was a phenomenal kind of imagination training for me. And then I lived in Ireland, and I created the first 2-year full-time permaculture course in the world that was always very hands-on. I've always loved that kind of just really hands-on stuff that says, actually, it's not that complicated. I kind of grew up with punk, and there was a thing in punk that used to be a thing of, said, here are 3 chords to play on a guitar, and they said, here are 3 chords, now form a band. And that kind of spirit, I just love. There was a guy who used to come and teach courses in cob building, kind of building with clay and straw, at the place I used to run in Ireland, who used to have a session called Foundations in 10 minutes, where he'd say, it's really not that complicated. I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about making foundations for a building in 10 minutes. Start the clock, go, and then he'd be off. And so I guess for me, I've always just loved that sense of, come on, let's just get on with it. And that's really what has, for me, has been a part of the transition movement, is to say, here we are, we're faced with an enormous crisis, and governments who aren't acting and responding. And of course, there's the things that we can do ourselves in our own lives. But what could we do with the people around us and the neighborhood and the resources that we have? And if we can create good what if spaces for thinking, and what can we do? I guess that's always kind of been my inquiry, really.
Amazing. And that's so lovely to hear. We certainly have seen some of the most beautiful, inspiring activity in the neighborhood where we're based at Civic Square. There's so much happening there around the future now, and so I can really resonate with that. And there's so much energy at a community level to turn that into practice. So hearing some of the things you've talked about, especially about the future being in you long before it arrives, is just amazing.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so we're going to go to...
I was just going to add one tiny little thing to that. Actually, if we listened to the Daily Mail, heaven forbid, and if we listened to kind of neoliberal economists, within 2 weeks of being into the COVID crisis, we would have all been out burning each other's houses down, and everything would have completely unraveled in complete mayhem. And actually, I think what we've seen has been the most phenomenal act of kind of mutual support and people looking out for each other, and all those networks of mutual support that have emerged. It always feels like governments dismiss and belittle and ignore community action like you're talking about around where you're based there. completely ignore and belittle it during times when everything is kind of going okay, and then when the shit hits the fan, say, "Oh, isn't this marvelous?" And Boris Johnson says, "Actually, there is such a thing as community," and we all think, "Well, we all knew that, sunshine," and the fact that you didn't is why we're in such a mess, you know. So, but actually, the important thing is that we build off that going forward, rather than just slide back to imagining that is somehow disposable.
Well, that's a perfect segue into this first question, actually, because there's something about what you just said about whether it's, I don't know whether it's purposeful that those structures can't imagine that communities can thrive in this way, or whether it's just literally that they can't imagine it. We can't imagine this other space and this different world where we're together and mutually supporting each other in projects. So the first question is from Paul Perkins, who is actually, I know who Paul is, and he works in local government. And his question is, perfect segue from your last point, what can local government and local authorities and those in them practically do to enable these sorts of spaces to emerge and these futures to be imagined?
Great question. Yeah, thank you, Paul. Well, I think, I certainly wouldn't want to paint a picture that somehow, that this is an idea that's just mine and there's nobody in local governments who are already working along these lines. There are some great things that are happening. I love in Camden, the Think and Do Centre that was created with Extinction Rebellion and Transition Kensal to Kilburn, Transition Kentish Town, and the local government as a kind of think and do, as a kind of civic imagination office in that neighbourhood, which the local government supported, and as part of their climate emergency stuff. I would always point people towards that example in Bologna. I just think everywhere should have a civic imagination office. It seems like such a beautiful, kind of really potentially far-reaching idea. I would say that there are now quite a few local governments who are looking at creating citizens' assemblies as one of the demands of Extinction Rebellion, but from other places as well. And I think potentially, if they're done well, citizens' assemblies can be a pretty amazing tool and a way of practicing direct democracy in that way. I guess the local governments that excite me most are the ones that really open up with lots of participatory budgeting and decision making, and I would point him to a project that the Transition Network has started and is very involved with, which is called Municipalities in Transition, which is a Europe-wide project of looking at that interface between bottom-up action and municipalities. And there's some really great case studies on there from across Europe of what that looks like in lots of different places.
Amazing, thank you, Rob. That's great example. I can add another one, which I know Paul already knows about, but for the audience, there's some great work happening down in Barking and Dagenham with a progressive council, a project called Everyone Every Day in Participatory City, and they've got lots of examples of practically how some of that comes to life. So some more questions from the audience. This next one's from Daniel, and there's loads of questions. If we don't get to all of them, we'll make sure Rob has them and can share them perhaps on social media, or add some answers in the chat later if he's around over the next 6 days at all. The next one's from Daniel. Is there anything about the governance in these places around different countries that facilitate the experiences and implementation of these imaginative ideas?
Well, I guess one of the places that feels like a real kind of hotbed of this is in Barcelona, which is one of the cities which came through the municipalist movement that grew out of the 15M movements, where they occupied the squares. And Ada Colau, who's the mayor, was an anti-eviction activist there. And they do some brilliant stuff in Barcelona, where they have neighborhood assemblies in every neighborhood, and the neighborhood assemblies meet and feed ideas up for policy making. They talk about the feminization of politics. They've done all sorts of really interesting things to look at how democracy works in a different and much deeper way in Barcelona. And I think in many ways it's one of the more kind of imaginative cities in the world. Their work they're doing around energy and housing and stuff is really fascinating. They're creating what they call super quarters, where they block off streets. Barcelona's kind of on grids, and they shut it off in different places, so the traffic moves around, and create these whole pedestrianized zones and turn them into spaces for play. I mean, Bologna, the work in Bologna, I think, has grown out of the fact that Bologna has long been one of the most kind of progressive cities in Italy. Something like 2/3 of adults are a member of at least one co-op, and it's a pretty happening place in that kind of a way. Yeah, so I guess there needs to be some, maybe, places like Frome where people come together and take over their own government and stuff can make a big difference as well. But also, I think, one of the things that's beautiful about imagination is that it thrives when it has limits. That actually, if I said, Imi, tell me a story now, you'd be like, oh, I don't know. Whereas if I said, tell me a story about the mouse that lives under the piano down the hall that has a little blue hat and has his own little tiny piano, when I put limits around it, then it's much easier. It's why we use haikus or rap, or why Dr. Seuss wrote a book with 50 words in, because limits make us more imaginative. So for me, some of the places that I see who are being most imaginative and welcoming the imagination are places that have declared a climate emergency and are taking that really seriously, and who aren't imagining that somehow business as usual is a possibility anymore. And that within that, then you see this flowering of imagination, because you have the limits that invite us to think outside the box of conventional development.
Oh wow, I hadn't even considered that idea of limits used in that really positive way. So that's really, yeah, thank you for that. It's real food for thought. We've got loads of questions, and I'm going to do as many as I can. But we've pasted them all into our private chat, so Rob can get back to people if we don't get through them all. So we've got a question from Meg. So Rob, what have you noticed about imagination projects that change into action, pragmatic action, and the ones that don't?
The thing that I've noticed about them is that the ones that turn into action are the ones where there is passion around making them happen. If, like, when I go to communities who are doing transition, and if they do big open space events or whatever, they will only create a local currency project if there are people who are passionate about creating a local currency project. If everyone is really passionate about food, they're not going to create a local currency project, because still most of the stuff that I meet and interact with is run by volunteers. So if you're going to be working with volunteers, you have to be working with what it is that people are really fired up about. And I think, since the beginning of the transition movement, we always had this sense that there's no point in just talking about this stuff. It has to turn over into actions very quickly. And we always had, since we started doing transition here in Totnes, our first couple of projects were always conceived of as, we want to start projects that people will talk to each other about in the pub. We want to start projects that have a story that people will go, geez, you know what they're doing in Totnes now? They're doing, so the very first thing we did was we wanted to plant some walnut trees. We were really taken with this idea that you can produce more protein and carbohydrate a hectare with hybrid walnut trees than you can with organically grown wheat. And we thought, why don't we just plant walnut trees everywhere? It makes complete sense in so many ways. So we planted a few walnut trees in the center of town. We invited the mayor to come along in all of her chains and everything, and to have a photograph taken planting walnuts and balancing walnuts on the end of a shovel. And we called it Totnes, the nut tree capital of Britain. We thought, actually, this idea of actually we're going to have cities competing with each other to become the nut tree capital of Britain. And as far as I'm concerned, no one else has ever challenged us for that title. So we still are the nut tree capital of Britain. And the Totnes Pound, which was the local currency project that we started, which was really based on the idea of printing our own money. Again, that was a question. This is we stopped it recently, but it ran for about 10 years. This is our £21 note, which I love, because people would always say, why do you have a £21 note? And we could say, well, why not? We can do whatever we like. Thank you very much. But it's about all of those questions. All of those projects started with a question. They stepped over into action, and always trying to bear in mind, how does this project become a story that people will tell each other and that can spread and multiply in that way?
Amazing. Thank you for that, Rob. A little personal moment there where you showed the £21 note. If there's any anyone from the Punjabi community in here, you'll know this strange tradition we have of every time you put £20 in a card or £50 in a card for a gift at a wedding or a birthday, our elders, particularly our grandparents, always put an extra pound in. So it's always £21, it's always £51, it's always £101. And nice. I can genuinely say, in the 30 years of life of me, my grandma's not here now, but asking her why we did this, she was like, I don't know. Well, we just do it. And so we'd always be scrambling around for that pound to make it 21 or 11 or 51 or 101. So nice. Goodness me, that note that you just showed could have solved a very practical problem for us. So yeah, why not? It would have been very helpful to us. Yeah. But yeah, on that note, I think we've got a couple of more questions. I've still got time, so we'll keep going. So building on what you said about projects that went into action, the role of the local authority, you know, having the mayor come and all of that. Beatrice asked the question of, what do you think about the balance of us being professional artists and designers in these projects and the wider sort of all of us as citizens? What do you think the balance of that role is, and have you seen it maybe play out?
Yeah, I love the story about people adding a pound on. I think we might just create a tradition where everybody has to put £22 in everything. Yeah, I feel like, and it's a thread that really runs through the book, is we can't do this without artists. You know, the climate emergency and the many other crises that we're facing at the moment, and finding a way through those, we can't do without artists. And all the projects I've worked on with artists, they bring a way of looking at things which is just fabulous. So the project I mentioned in the talk there, the Transition Town Anywhere project with the cardboard boxes, that's an art project, and actually when it's finished, you've jointly created a work of art, but you've also created something that has been profoundly immersive and extraordinary for all the people. And there is a whole chapter in the book about, you know, why we need artists and how artists can help this stuff to really accelerate. How do we create pop-up tomorrows? How do we become the best storytellers we can be? How do we bring that vision of a different future alive in the present? Is something where we desperately need artists. And every opportunity I get to work with artists, I just seize it with both hands, because they bring such richness and such a different way of looking at this. And you know, we're so surrounded by dystopias and stories about how it all went wrong, and stories about how we were wiped out by plagues and gremlins and zombies and monsters from space and weird slimy things, but we very rarely hear any stories about how it turned out okay, and how we came together and got our shit together and created something amazing. And we need those stories, whether they're graphic novels or cartoons or massive murals or installations or whatever, you know. And I feel like the potential that this way of revaluing the imagination that I argue for, you know, in the book I say, one of the things we need now is a National Imagination Act. We have devalued and debased our collective imagination to such a degree that it's like, you know, we recognize that if a population isn't sufficiently nourished with good food, we will see a rise in preventable illnesses and people unable to reach their full potential. We recognize that if we don't educate people well enough, then collectively we fail to live up to our capacity. But this decline of the imagination is something happening just outside of our range of view, and that we don't notice, but the implications of it are really quite terrifying, I think. So to put it back and say, no, this really matters, and to say we need a National Imagination Act, we need to enshrine the right to an imaginative life, and it needs to run back through everything that happens in society. That creates so many endless openings and opportunities for artists and for working with artists, I think.
That's amazing point and thought about how we legislate for it. We've had one of our team members, Amy Martin, who leads our radical childcare work, has talked a lot about countries and places that have legislated for play and what that has meant. And so the idea of legislating and really valuing what it means to erode ideas like play and imagination from a population, and the impact of that needs to be better understood. So that's a really great segue to this next question. It's almost like you know what's coming, but so this is a good one, because so say we get to this point where we're thinking about departments of imaginations, ministries of civic imagination, and imagination acts, and really legislating it and embedding it. We've got a question from Ed Parks. How do you relate to the phase of, say, something like Big Society that we went through briefly 10 years ago, where some of these ideas were co-opted by that, and how can we be mindful of about being co-opted again? And I'm just interested in what you think about the balance of sort of that kind of question, and where you're talking about, what happens when these ideas do get picked up more by the mainstream, and what do we need to be mindful of?
I think that's a really, really important question, and I feel like we need to fight for the imagination. Like there's a beautiful quote again by Ursula Le Guin, who said, "In the marketplace, the word creativity has come to mean the generation of ideas applicable to practical strategies to make larger profits. This reduction has gone on so long that the word creative can hardly be degraded further. I don't use it anymore, yielding it to capitalists and academics to abuse as they like, but they can't have imagination." And that feels to me like that. Like I completely go along with that. I feel like we need to be holding spaces for imagination. But I also feel like, if Boris Johnson was to stand up and say, "We are the government of imagination," the sort of overwhelming chorus of laughter that would come back at them would sort of just sink the idea that they could somehow co-opt that. Innovation and creativity are something that can be that can be kind of taken and co-opted. Imagination is much, much harder to do that with, I think, which is why what I try and do with this book and with the work I do in transition, and so the work that we do with that needs to be really clear about the imagination and its potential, and how it needs to be something that is owned and determined by people. It's why bureaucrats and politicians hate the imagination, because it's unpredictable, it's a bit naughty, it's kind of it's playful and bold and mischievous. And that's something that people who like to put things into neat little boxes really don't like very much. But it's absolutely the quality that we need now. I always say to people, innovation and imagination are fundamentally different things. That also that every government that gets elected says, "We're going to have a national innovation plan." But innovation is something that you do when your fundamental model works. So innovation, like I always talk about it like pizza. I say to people, you can innovate with pizza, because pizza is great and we all understand pizza and we love pizza. So you can innovate with different flour and different toppings and different cheeses. You don't need to reimagine pizza, and that would just be ridiculous, because pizza is a fundamentally great thing. Neoliberal growth-based economics are not like pizza. Neoliberal growth-based economics are pushing us off a cliff at increasing speed in a way that is psychopathic and sociopathic and insane. And when you live with that as your model, then you don't need innovation, you need imagination, because you need to reimagine everything from the ground up. So that's why I feel like the quality that we need to be nurturing through education, through politics, through activism, through everything is imagination rather than this obsession with innovation.
Amazing. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Rob. There's so much good stuff in here. We could talk easily for another half an hour. There's two big questions that I don't think we'll have time for, but I want to just share them because I think they're really, really important. And perhaps Rob can share some things in the chat when he gets off this call, or later when he maybe has some time. But so there's two questions that I think are really important. One was from Madeline, around Madeline Maxwell, who talks about, in the civic and community action space, there's more and more focus on impact measurement and evaluation and theories of change. And from your perspective, how do you get a balance of like getting on with it and imagining and taking space for ideas, and you know, a lot of what the social space is really valuing and measuring right now. So that's one question that I think could be great if you could give some thoughts on, maybe in the chat later or on your social media or something like that. And then a second really important one, because this has been talked about in so many different ways, especially recently as the Lives Matter rising into the mainstream. We can see it everywhere. You know, the work has been happening for many years, but recently we've seen so much more of the murder of George Floyd. Paul asks about the fact that trauma fragments the relational field, which forecloses the imagination and limits a person's ability to create and sustain a positive vision for the future. Undoubtedly, healing rises from the imagination. So what simple activities do you suggest that people can do to reignite their imagination? And so what I don't think we have time for is because that's the subject of trauma is such an important one. There's so many questions and comments that have come about that, and it's probably something that we could have a follow-up conversation or do something more after the festival to really focus on that, because time is now short. But do you have anything that you want to share on the idea of just practical activities that can help people to reignite their own imagination?
Yeah, no, and both really, really important questions. And certainly the journey for me of researching this book was one where I started out, I had never made the link between imagination and trauma before. And it's endlessly fascinating to me in all the different layers in which we can pick through that. And there are people who are far more qualified and more informed than me to write about, to talk about trauma, I suppose. But I in terms of what people can do, I guess a simple exercise would be to go back to the bit that you read out at the beginning. You know, I often do an exercise with groups, whether it's 10 people or I did it with 1,500 people in a hall in Belgium about 6 months ago, which is where you close your eyes and I go and I say we're going to attempt the first act of collective time travel in the history of this place, and you invite everyone to close their eyes, and then you travel to 2030 and you just go for a walk around in your imagination, and it's not utopia, but we've done everything we could possibly have done was done during those 10 years. It was a time of extraordinary, profound, unprecedented, rapid change that in 2020 felt completely unimaginable. It was a time that future generations look back to, and they tell great stories and sing great songs about that amazing time when things changed. And then to go for a walk around, multi-sensory imagining. What does it smell like and feel like? What do you hear? Go for a walk around like I did in that piece, you know. And I've done it with so many different groups, and people say to me, one woman said to me, I've been a climate activist for 20 years. I've never done this. And this should be a daily practice. And most people, every time I do it, often the same things come up. People say the bird song is a lot louder. The streets are clear from cars. The air smells amazing. There's a shared sense of collective purpose. There's food gardens everywhere. And actually the last couple of months, that's not quite so hard to imagine. You know, we can go outside, we can see that world has been there. And my hope is that we can use that as the foundation to build our imaginations off, so we don't think about resilience as being how we bounce back to how things were, but how we bounce forward to something way, way better. So I would suggest just find yourself some quiet space to go and sit and do that exercise, and to maybe do it regularly, revisit it regularly, so that you really create that as a kind of three-dimensional imagining. And it's what one of the people I interviewed in the book calls memories of the future. How do we create new memories of the future, a kind of a new North Star that isn't just facts and figures and policies, but is something that we can almost taste when we close our eyes.
That's absolutely incredible. Thank you, Rob. You've given so many beautiful just stories and bringing together of many ideas, and just a space for so many of us to just have a moment to just think, you know, what if things did turn out okay. So first of all, I'd really like to say thank you to you for your time. And what your talk really brought up for me is this idea of meeting the imagination halfway, of actually just narratives and starting to talk your way through a lot of this. And I came across some of the most profound work that I think is happening at the moment, that has been long history of this in Black feminist scholars and thinkers around prison abolition. And it's already starting to be like co-opted as things that some people can't imagine. And I'm definitely not the right person to talk in depth about the expertise and the incredible decades of work that have happened on that. But there was this Instagram series, and I've saved them all, but I can't figure out who the author is yet. That's why I haven't shared them, because I didn't want to not author them. But there was one example where there was like 8 or 9 different slides that this person had shared around imagining police or prison dismantling. And one of the examples was, you don't realize, but your brake lights aren't working. Imagine a city employee signals for you to pull over and says, hey, how about I replace those lights for you right here so no one gets hurt? An hour later, both lights work and you're both home. ... Isn't that public safety? And I really enjoyed this idea of just imagining scenarios where we're looking out for each other, and it wasn't just it was allowing people to think about that. So I just want to say thank you so much for your time. I'm going to unmute you in a second so you can say bye as well. We've got another session starting 2 minutes ago, so I am going to wrap up this and invite you to chat to others in the chat. And you can see Rob on Twitter. You can get his wonderful book, hopefully from a nice independent bookshop like Hive, or from the library, or share one of yours and post it to someone maybe when you've finished with it. But I think just to wrap up here, there'll be a couple of minutes sort of crossover to the next section, and I wonder if the audience can go and just pick up that piece of paper that they're going to free write on later on, or maybe if they don't come to the next session and they're going to something else, and you start to place yourself in 2030. Like Rob said, what does it smell like? What does it feel like? What happens when we did everything we could to create a world that was safer, more equitable, just, that recognised the climate and many other emergencies and crises that we're facing? And maybe just go and get the notebook that you're going to start writing that in, or maybe start the free writing the activity, or go and get a piece of paper to headline and do it later on. And just get yourself in that space where you maybe think about the what if story that we shared at the beginning. And say to you, Rob, thank you so much for your time and inspiration. It's been, someone who's just read your book, it was still lovely to like hear it all again and just hear it in such a pragmatic way. And what I really like about this, and the connection to the last talk, is demystifying it. Let's not try and make it magic. The future isn't some magic thing that we don't know how to do. It's something that we create through our actions, our dreams, our stories, our narratives. And you've brought that to life so well.
Well, thank you everybody. It's been delightful. And you mentioned the prison abolition movement, and I feel like that is one of the greatest what if questions in the world at the moment. What if we dismantle prisons and dismantle police and did it all in a completely different way? And such profound respect for people who've kept that what if question alive back since the 60s and before then, because keeping the kind of candle of a what if question burning through that period of time is just phenomenal. And it's such an amazing question, because it opens up so much possibility and so much fresh way of looking at things and reimagining things. And maybe we can allow ourselves to dream that the time has come for those questions to really shape where the future goes from here. So all of the what if questions that we ask now stand on the shoulders of amazing, brave, brilliant, imaginative people going back through history. And but thank you so much, and this is a wonderful event. Thank you for inviting me and for chairing so beautifully. Thank you.